The planet Lizara was burning. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now filled with the dark clouds of war. The ground shook beneath the feet of the panicked citizens as explosions echoed through the streets. Ships hovered above, firing deadly beams at the city's walls. The Null, a cold and merciless machine race, had arrived. Captain Elias Work was running. Sweat soaked his uniform as he sprinted through the ruins of the capital, clutching something precious in his arms. He had only one goal: survival. In his arms was a child, small and fragile, but her presence was a symbol of something far more important. Princess Elira, the daughter of Queen Varelia of the Lysari, was the last hope for her people. She had no idea of the danger she was in or the weight she carried. All she knew was that the world around her was ending. The queen, once the proud and noble leader of the Lysari, was dying. Rourke had seen it with his own eyes. He had been a prisoner of the Lysari for months, a captive in their war against the Null, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when Queen Varelia had turned to him, blood staining her broken armor, and whispered a final, desperate plea. "I'll never see my daughter again," she said, her voice trembling with grief. "Take her, keep her safe. Promise me." It had been a quiet moment, one filled with sadness and desperation. The queen, who had commanded armies and led her people with strength and pride, had shown her vulnerability. In that single moment, she was a mother, desperate to save her child. Rourke, despite the war and despite the hatred between their species, nodded. He had promised her. And now, there was no turning back. As the battle raged around them, Rourke ran. The capital city of Lizara was collapsing, its beautiful structures crumbling to dust. The Null machines were relentless, tearing through everything in their path, without mercy. Their robotic eyes glowed red, searching for anything alive. But Rourke wasn't their target, yet. He was carrying something they didn't understand, something they would never stop hunting. A living child, the last hope of the Lysari. He reached the outskirts of the city, where an old transport ship waited. The pilot, a grizzled Lysari who had once fought beside Queen Varelia, stared at Rourke in disbelief. "You've got her?" the pilot asked, his voice thick with worry. "You're carrying the princess?" "Yes," Rourke said, his voice steady. "We're leaving. Now." The pilot hesitated, but then nodded. Rourke climbed aboard the ship, cradling the princess in his arms. The engines roared to life, and as the ship lifted off the ground, Rourke looked down at the burning world below. He had kept his promise. He had saved Elira. But deep inside, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The stars outside the ship's window seemed so peaceful, so far away, but inside the cockpit, Elias Work was anything but calm. His hands gripped the controls of the transport, knuckles white. Princess Elira, the last hope of the Lysari people, was asleep in the seat next to him, her small body curled up under a blanket. She looked so innocent, so unaware of the danger that followed them. Rourke had promised Queen Varelia that he would protect her daughter. But that promise weighed heavily on his heart, and the closer he got to deep space, the more he realized how hard it would be to keep. They were not just running from the Null. They were running from the entire galaxy. Lysari enemies, bounty hunters, and spies would stop at nothing to find them, and they would tear apart the universe to get to Elira. Rourke glanced over at the princess, her face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the war that raged around her. She was too young to understand, but he wasn't. He could feel the weight of her future pressing down on him. The moment he had taken her into his arms, he had sworn to give his life for her if necessary, but that didn't make it any easier. The ship's eye, a deep, calm voice that Rourke had grown used to, chimed in. "Captain, we are nearing the boundary of Null-controlled space. Estimated time to reach safe passage is 3 hours." 3 hours, Rourke muttered, wiping his face with his hand. Not enough time. He had a plan. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He would take Elira to Veltheros, a barren moon on the edge of known space. It was a place few cared about, a place where the galaxy's outcasts and criminals made their homes. There, he hoped to find someone who could help them, a contact who could lead them to the exile cradle, a hidden safe haven where the last of the Lissari people had gone into hiding. But Veltheros was dangerous. It was known for its ruthless smugglers, mercenaries, and people who had no interest in loyalty or honor. Rourke would have to trust a few shady characters, people who didn't care about the war, or the Null, or even Elira's royal blood. They cared only for survival. As the ship passed through the empty void of space, Rourke tried to focus. The only thing that mattered now was keeping Elira safe. He could still hear the Queen's final words in his mind, as clear as if she were standing next to him. "Take her, Captain. Keep her safe." The pain in her voice had been unmistakable. It was a mother's cry, one that would haunt him forever. It wasn't just about saving Elira. It was about giving her a future, a chance to rebuild her people. The weight of that responsibility crushed Rourke, but he couldn't back down. He had made a vow, and no matter the danger, no matter the cost, he would keep it. Princess Elira stirred in her seat and opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light of the cockpit. She looked at Rourke, confusion in her gaze. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Rourke's heart softened. For a moment, the fierce soldier within him faded, and all that remained was a man who had promised to protect a child. He smiled at her, even though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "To a place where you'll be safe," he said gently. "I'll make sure of it." And with that, he pushed the ship forward, heading into the unknown. The small transport ship glided silently through the emptiness of space, its engines humming softly as it made its way toward Veltheros. The barren moon was located on the edge of known space, a place that most people forgot about, or didn't care about. The dust-filled atmosphere and endless stretches of cracked earth made it a perfect hiding spot for those who wanted to disappear. Rourke had never been to Veltheros before, but he had heard stories about the people who lived there, the smugglers, the outcasts, the criminals. It wasn't a safe place, but it was better than nothing. As the ship descended toward the moon's surface, the view outside shifted from stars to the cold, dusty expanse below. The moment the ship touched down, Rourke's heart began to race. He had no idea what kind of trouble they would face here, but he knew one thing for sure: there would be trouble. The moment he stepped off the ship with Elira, he would be a target. His uniform made him an easy mark, and anyone who saw the princess would know exactly who she was. "Elira," Rourke said, turning to the young girl who was now awake and staring out the small window. "Stay close. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you it's safe. Understand?" The princess nodded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She had been through so much already, her world destroyed, her mother gone. But she was brave, much braver than most people her age. Rourke admired that about her, even though he hated that she had to grow up so quickly. The ship's hatch opened with a hiss, and the dry wind of Veltheros rushed in. Rourke stepped out first, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The ground was cracked and uneven, and the sky was an eerie orange, like the color of a dying flame. A few broken-down buildings lined the horizon, and in the distance he saw a group of figures huddled together, their faces hidden behind dust masks and hoods. "This is it," Rourke muttered to himself. He knew they wouldn't find help here easily, but they had to try. "Elira," he said, looking down at the girl who had now stepped beside him. "We need to find someone named Corin. He's an old contact of mine. He owes me a favor, and he might be able to help us. But we have to be careful. He's not the kind of person who trusts easily." As they made their way through the desolate landscape, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the moon itself was holding its breath. The silence around them was broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dry ground. They reached the small cluster of buildings, where the group of figures were gathered. Rourke kept his eyes sharp, watching every movement. The last thing they needed was to get caught up in a fight. One of the figures, a tall man with a rough face and a scar over his left eye, stepped forward, blocking their path. He didn't look friendly. "You lost, soldier?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "This isn't a place for tourists." Rourke's hand instinctively rested on the hilt of his blaster, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He didn't want to start a fight. Instead, he kept his voice steady. "I'm looking for Corin," Rourke said. "I got business with him." The man's eyes narrowed. Then he looked past Rourke at Elira, who stood quietly beside him. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Corin's not here. But if you're looking for him, I can take you to someone who might know where he is. It'll cost you." Rourke hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in a deal with someone like this, but they had no choice. "How much?" he asked. The man grinned. "We'll talk about it once you've got the information." With no other option, Rourke nodded. They had just stepped deeper into the shadows of Veltheros, and there was no turning back now. Rourke followed the man through the dust-choked streets of Veltheros. The sunless sky stretched overhead, a constant reminder of the desolate world they had landed on. Elira walked quietly beside him, her small hand clutching the edge of his jacket. The silence between them felt heavy. Rourke could feel the weight of her innocence, so out of place in this harsh, unforgiving world. The man who had agreed to help them led them through narrow alleys, where the ground was littered with broken glass and metal scraps. The buildings here were barely standing, their walls cracked and hollow. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned long ago, but there were people here, living in the shadows. They reached the edge of the settlement, where the ruins of an old human battlecruiser loomed like a ghost from another time. The massive ship had crashed years ago, its metal hull battered and twisted by the harsh conditions of Veltheros. It was surrounded by a few makeshift buildings and camps where scavengers lived, picking through the wreckage for anything of value. Rourke stopped. This was it. He could feel the strange pull of the place, like a memory from a past life. This ship had once been part of a great fleet, and now it was just a broken shell. But it had a secret, a way forward. "This is where Corin is hiding," the man said, looking up at the ship with a mix of respect and fear. "He lives inside. But be warned, not everyone who enters that ship comes back out the same." Rourke didn't respond. He couldn't afford to show fear, especially not in front of Elira. He nodded and began walking toward the entrance of the wreckage, his boots crunching over the dry, cracked earth. The man hesitated for a moment, then followed, keeping a distance behind them. The entrance to the battlecruiser was a jagged hole in the side of the ship. It was dark inside, the air stale and heavy with the smell of oil and rust. Rourke drew a breath, adjusting the blaster at his side. He didn't know what to expect inside, but he knew one thing for sure. Corin was the only one who might have information about where to find the exile cradle, the last refuge for the Lissari people. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. The ship was a maze of broken halls, empty rooms, and old control panels that flickered with life only when they passed too close. It was like walking through the skeleton of a forgotten war. They finally reached the heart of the ship, where Corin waited. The man was sitting on a broken chair, surrounded by crates of supplies and a few old weapons. His face was hidden by a hood, but Rourke recognized him immediately. Corin was an old acquaintance, someone he'd worked with during his military days. He was dangerous, unpredictable, but useful. And right now, he was their best chance. "You're here," Corin said, his voice gruff and quiet. "I didn't think you'd actually show up." Rourke nodded. "We need your help, Corin. I'm looking for the exile cradle. You know where it is." Corin leaned back in his chair, studying them both. His eyes flicked to Elira, who stood quietly behind Rourke. The silence stretched for a moment before Corin spoke again. "You're asking for something dangerous," he said slowly. "The exile cradle isn't a place for someone like her, or you. But I've got information. Maybe it's worth the price." Rourke's grip tightened on his blaster, but he didn't raise it. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. "I'll pay any price," Rourke said, his voice steady. Corin's smile was dark and knowing. "We'll see." The atmosphere inside the wrecked battlecruiser was thick with tension. Corin had just agreed to help, but Rourke knew better than to trust the man completely. In this world, no one helped without wanting something in return, and Corin was no exception. Still, they had no choice. If Corin had information about the exile cradle, they needed it. After a long silence, Corin stood up from his broken chair and motioned for Rourke and Elira to follow. "The exile cradle isn't a place anyone can find easily," he said, leading them through the dark corridors of the ship. "But I know someone who might have the answers, an old friend of mine. They call him the Archivist." "The Archivist?" Rourke asked, raising an eyebrow. "Who is he?" Corin didn't answer right away, his face growing serious. "He's a keeper of secrets," Corin replied. "A man who knows things, dangerous things. He's got a maze of memories inside his mind, memories of places, people, and hidden paths that even the Null don't know about. If anyone can help you find the cradle, it's him." Rourke wasn't sure if he trusted Corin's cryptic words, but he didn't have time to question them. They needed the Archivist's help. The journey to find him was not an easy one, however. They walked deeper into the ship, past rooms filled with old equipment, and into a part of the wreckage that seemed untouched by time. Eventually, they reached a narrow door hidden in the shadows of the ship's vast hull. Corin knocked twice, then paused. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old datapads, holographic maps, and strange alien artifacts. The man who stood inside was older than Rourke had expected. His hair was thin and white, and his eyes gleamed with a quiet intelligence. He wore a simple robe that looked like it had been stitched together from various pieces of old fabric, and his hands were covered in strange, glowing tattoos. "Ah, Corin," the Archivist said, his voice soft but sharp, like the sound of an old record playing. "I wasn't expecting company." His eyes flicked to Elira, and a small smile played on his lips. "And who is this?" "This is Princess Elira," Rourke said firmly. "She's the last hope for her people. We need your help. We need to find the exile cradle." The Archivist's smile faded. He turned his gaze from Elira to Rourke, studying him for a long moment. There was something unsettling about the way the Archivist looked at them, as though he could see into their very souls. "The exile cradle." The Archivist's voice trailed off as he reached for a small datapad. "Such a place is not for the faint of heart. It holds the last of the Lissari's legacy, and its location is hidden, even from the Null. Only those with the right knowledge can find it." He paused, his fingers dancing over the pad's surface. "But you're not the first to search for it." Rourke's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The Archivist looked up, his eyes dark. "Others have come before you. They sought the cradle for their own reasons, but they didn't return. The cradle is protected by forces even I can't fully understand. The path to it is not just physical, it's mental. You'll need more than just courage." "Then tell us how to find it," Rourke said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have no time." The Archivist hesitated, then nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice growing serious. "But be warned, Captain Rourke, what lies ahead is more than just a place. It is a test of your very spirit." He handed Rourke the datapad. "Follow the path. But know this, the cradle will choose its next guardian, and it may not choose you." Rourke took the pad, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Elira, who seemed both curious and frightened by what she had just heard. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. The ship shook as it entered the atmosphere of Shadow Point, the small forgotten planet at the edge of the galaxy. The land below was barren, with jagged rocks and deep valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see. It was a place of no importance to most, but to those who lived in the shadows, it was a perfect hiding spot. Rourke gripped the controls of the ship tightly, his eyes focused on the narrow landing strip ahead. Beside him, Elira sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the rocky landscape below. She had grown quieter over the past few days, as if the weight of their journey was beginning to settle on her small shoulders. Rourke couldn't blame her. The world she knew was gone, and now she was a fugitive in a galaxy that didn't care for the innocent. "Are we safe here?" Elira asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Rourke glanced over at her, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll be safe for now, but we need to find a guide. Someone who knows how to get us to the exile cradle." The ship touched down with a soft thud, kicking up a cloud of dust as it settled on the dry ground. The door opened with a hiss, and Rourke stepped out first, scanning the area. Shadow Point was as desolate as it looked, with only a few old buildings and scattered camps. It wasn't the type of place you'd visit unless you had no other choice. They made their way through the dusty settlement, where the few people they saw eyed them warily. Rourke kept his hand close to his blaster, always ready for trouble. He didn't trust this place. He didn't trust anyone here. As they passed a cluster of ramshackle buildings, Rourke's senses went on high alert. There was something off. The air felt too still. His instincts screamed at him, and he instinctively grabbed Elira's arm. "Stay close," he whispered. They continued walking, but the silence was broken by a loud clang, a metal door slamming open. Before Rourke could react, a group of men appeared from the shadows, surrounding them. The leader, a tall figure with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Elira. "You've got the princess," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "I knew someone would come for her eventually, but I didn't expect it to be a human soldier." Rourke's hand slid to his blaster, his mind racing. He had known this would happen. They were being hunted, and Shadow Point was the perfect place for an ambush. But they weren't prepared for this. "What do you want?" Rourke asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled, showing a row of crooked teeth. "What we want is simple," he said. "We want the princess. You're a valuable prisoner, Captain, but the real prize is her." Elira clutched Rourke's sleeve, her face pale with fear. Rourke could feel her trembling beside him, but he didn't show it. He had to protect her. There was no other option. The man's smile widened. "You don't have much of a choice. Hand her over, and we might let you go. Fight, and, well, let's just say things won't end well for you." Rourke knew they were outnumbered. They didn't stand a chance against this many armed men. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Not when the fate of Elira, and the entire Lissari people, was at stake. "Get ready," Rourke muttered to Elira, his hand inching toward his blaster. But before he could make a move, a sharp whistle pierced the air. A loud explosion rocked the ground, sending a cloud of dust and debris flying into the air. For a moment, everything was chaos, smoke, noise, and the sudden ringing in Rourke's ears. He stumbled back, shielding Elira with his body as the ground trembled beneath them. When the dust finally settled, the group of attackers had been scattered, some lying unconscious on the ground, others stumbling away. A figure emerged from the smoke, tall, wearing a heavy cloak. He stepped forward, his face hidden under the hood. Without saying a word, he gave Rourke a nod, and then turned toward the wreckage of the ambush. "You owe me," the figure said, his voice cold and harsh. "Now let's get you to where you need to go." Rourke didn't have time to argue. They had been saved, barely. But now, they had a new problem. Who was this person, and could they trust him? The man who had saved them stood in front of Rourke, tall and imposing, with his cloak billowing in the wind. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his presence was unmistakable. Rourke had seen enough of the galaxy's underworld to know that this man wasn't someone to mess with. He was a shadow, a figure who belonged to the dark corners of the universe. "Who are you?" Rourke asked, his voice wary but steady. He had no time for unnecessary questions, but he needed to understand who had just saved them and why. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to look at Elira, who was still clutching Rourke's sleeve. She was wide-eyed, confused, but Rourke could see the trust starting to grow in her. She had been through so much already, and now she was relying on a stranger. "I'm someone who can help you," the man said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "But I don't help for free." Rourke's grip on his blaster tightened. "What do you want?" The man stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dry ground. "I want information. The kind of information you won't find in the usual places. Something valuable. You have the key to a future that many would kill for. The princess is the key to the Lissari's survival, and I need to know more about the exile cradle." Rourke felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a random encounter. The man knew about the cradle. That meant he knew about their mission. "You know about the exile cradle?" Rourke asked, keeping his voice calm. "Why do you want to help us?" The man's expression remained hidden, but his voice carried a certain weight. "I've seen the galaxy burn, Captain. I've watched empires fall, and people lose everything. But I also know when to act. The cradle is important to more than just the Lissari. It's something that could change everything. And if I help you, I'll be part of that change." Rourke exchanged a quick glance with Elira. Her face was still full of fear, but there was something else there, too, hope. It was a dangerous feeling, but he could see that she was clinging to it. She was searching for something to believe in. "We don't have much choice," Rourke said after a moment, his mind racing with the possibilities. He didn't trust this man. He didn't trust anyone. But he knew they couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. "But we're not doing this for you. We're doing this for Elira. And for her people." The man gave a slight nod. "Understood. But remember, Captain, the exile cradle is not just a place. It's a test. Only those who are worthy will be allowed inside. And if you fail, you may not get another chance." Rourke took a deep breath, his hand still on his blaster. "Then we'll make sure we pass the test." Without another word, the stranger turned and began walking toward a small, hidden shuttle parked in the distance. It was sleek, unmarked, and clearly built for speed. The kind of ship that could disappear into the stars without a trace. "I'll take you to the coordinates you need," the man called over his shoulder. "But after that, you're on your own." Rourke hesitated for a moment, then turned to Elira. She nodded at him, her expression determined, though her eyes still held a trace of uncertainty. She was starting to understand the gravity of their mission, the risks they were about to face. But there was a strength in her that Rourke hadn't seen before. "Let's go," Rourke said, his voice steady. "We'll do this together." As they walked toward the shuttle, Rourke couldn't help but feel the weight of their journey pressing down on him. They were heading into the unknown, with no guarantees, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The shuttle's door hissed open, and they climbed inside, ready for whatever lay ahead. The stars outside seemed to watch them, distant and cold, as they began their journey to find the exile cradle. But Rourke wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The shuttle moved silently through the blackness of space, the stars a blanket of distant lights above them. Inside, Rourke sat in the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the dark expanse ahead. Elira sat beside him, her small hands nervously twisting in her lap. The stranger, still cloaked and silent, was seated behind them, his eyes always watching, his presence as cold and mysterious as the stars outside. They had been traveling for hours, and Rourke could feel the tension building. Every moment brought them closer to the exile cradle, but also closer to unknown dangers. He wasn't sure if the stranger could be trusted, but at this point, there was no other choice. They needed him. They needed answers. Elira broke the silence first. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place, the cradle?" Rourke glanced at her, offering a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a place from ancient Lissari history, a sanctuary, where their people went to hide, to protect their legacy. Only a few know of it, and even fewer can find it. Elira nodded, though her eyes remained uncertain. She had lost everything: the warmth of her home, the love of her mother, and now she was being led to a place she didn't fully understand. Rourke could see the fear in her eyes, and it twisted something in his chest. He had promised her mother he would protect her, but sometimes he felt like he was just dragging her into a nightmare. As the shuttle continued its course, the stranger in the back finally spoke. "We're getting close," he said, his voice low and almost casual. "Soon, you'll need to be ready. The cradle won't reveal itself easily. It's not just a physical journey. You'll have to prove yourselves." Rourke turned in his seat, meeting the man's gaze. "Prove ourselves how?" The stranger's smile was faint, barely noticeable under his hood. "Only the worthy can enter. You'll be tested. And if you fail..." His voice trailed off, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Elira shivered at the sound of those words, but Rourke's mind was already racing. What kind of test awaited them? The exile cradle was supposed to be a place of refuge, but it sounded more like a trial. It was almost as if the cradle itself was alive, choosing who could enter and who could not. "There's no turning back," Rourke said softly, mostly to himself. He had made a promise, and now it was time to see it through. The shuttle suddenly jolted, pulling Rourke's attention back to the controls. He quickly adjusted the navigation, his heart pounding. They had entered a dense asteroid field, the rocks hurtling past them at terrifying speeds. It wasn't just the field itself that worried him, it was what lay beyond it. The exile cradle's location was hidden behind a dangerous veil of asteroids, designed to keep unwanted travelers away. "Hold on tight," Rourke muttered to Elira, who was gripping her seat with wide, frightened eyes. The shuttle's engines roared as Rourke expertly maneuvered through the field, dodging asteroid after asteroid. His hands moved quickly, guiding the ship through the gaps in the deadly rocks. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Not now, not with Elira's life on the line. The stranger said nothing, only watching intently, his fingers tapping on the armrest. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, Rourke saw it. Through the mist of asteroids, there was a faint glimmer. A faint, blue glow, barely visible in the distance. The cradle. But it wasn't just a place. It was a structure, ancient, massive, and impossibly beautiful, floating in the heart of the asteroid field, untouched by time. The exile cradle was more than Rourke had ever imagined. The shuttle slowed as they approached. The blue light grew brighter, and Rourke could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. He had no idea what awaited them, but one thing was certain: they had arrived. The real test was about to begin. The shuttle hovered in front of the exile cradle, its engines humming softly. The blue glow from the structure seemed to pulse, as if the cradle itself were alive, watching them approach. Rourke could feel his heart racing, the weight of their mission pressing on him like never before. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. But even as he set the shuttle down gently on the cradle's surface, doubt gnawed at him. "What happens now?" Elira asked, her voice trembling slightly as she glanced out the window, her eyes wide with awe and fear. Rourke looked over at her. "We go inside," he said, his voice steady, but his thoughts a whirlwind. The cradle wasn't just a place. It was a test, one that would determine if they were worthy of the Lissari's legacy. The stranger in the back of the shuttle finally spoke. "Remember what I told you. The cradle chooses who it will accept. If you're not worthy, it won't let you through. Not even I know what the test will be." Rourke nodded, his jaw set. He had no choice but to trust the stranger, at least for now. But the closer they got, the more he questioned everything. What kind of test could the cradle have for them? Would they be able to succeed? Or would they fail, and all their sacrifices be for nothing? The shuttle doors slid open with a hiss, and a cold wind swept into the cabin. The air was thin but clean, and the ground beneath them seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. Rourke stepped out first, his boots crunching softly on the crystalline surface. Elira followed closely behind, her small form looking fragile in the vast emptiness of the cradle. The stranger was last, stepping out without a word, his eyes scanning their surroundings with an unreadable expression. They stood at the entrance of a massive ancient doorway, its surface carved with strange symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and change when they looked at them. The door was closed, but it beckoned them forward. "This is it," Rourke said, taking a deep breath. "We go through together." Elira nodded, her face pale but determined. She had already lost so much. She wasn't going to lose her people, too. As they approached the door, it began to open slowly, its massive stone panels sliding apart with a low, echoing groan. Beyond it, they saw a large chamber, bathed in the same blue light that had illuminated the surface. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on that pedestal sat a glowing crystal. Rourke stepped forward, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, a voice echoed in his mind. It was not the voice of a person, but something deeper, older. "Who dares to enter the cradle?" the voice asked, its tone calm but full of ancient power. "What is your purpose?" Rourke froze, his heart racing. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room with its presence. He glanced at Elira, who was standing still beside him, her face full of questions. "We seek the exile cradle," Rourke said, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. "I am Rourke, and this is Princess Elira. We seek to protect her people and restore their future." The voice was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again, softer this time, as if considering his words. "Very well," the voice said, "but know this. The cradle does not give its gifts freely. To claim what you seek, you must prove your worth. Only then will the way be revealed." The chamber suddenly began to tremble. The pedestal rose slightly, and the glowing crystal pulsed brightly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Rourke felt the air grow heavier, and a cold chill ran down his spine. The test had begun. Without warning, the room shifted, and the floor beneath their feet cracked open, revealing a deep, dark abyss below. A voice echoed once more, now filled with challenge. "Face your fears, prove your resolve, and the cradle will give you the path you seek." Rourke took a step forward, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. He had promised Elira's mother he would protect her, and he would. The test was starting, and he wasn't about to fail. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the dark abyss below them seemed to swallow the light. Rourke's heart raced, and Elira stood beside him, her hand gripping his sleeve tightly. The voice of the cradle still echoed in their minds, demanding that they face their fears to prove their worth. But what did that mean? What kind of trial awaited them? "I won't let it take you," Rourke whispered to Elira, his voice low and filled with resolve. He didn't know what the cradle wanted, but he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The chamber shifted again. The walls seemed to close in, the space around them narrowing. Shadows flickered in the corners, forming strange shapes that seemed to move of their own will. A cold breeze swept through the room, and Rourke could feel the tension growing, pressing on him like a weight. The voice returned, softer this time. "To face your fear is to face yourself. Only then can you understand the truth." Rourke's mind raced. Was the cradle testing their courage, or was it testing something deeper? He didn't have time to think too long before the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a stairway leading down into the darkness. Without a word, Rourke stepped forward, taking the first step down. Elira followed close behind, her eyes wide with fear, but her determination stronger than her fear. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to whisper, filling their minds with doubts and fears. Rourke's mind was flooded with images of his past, the lives he had failed to save, the battles he had lost, and the people he had let down. He saw himself, not as the strong captain he was now, but as a man who had failed, who had been too slow, too weak. Suddenly, a voice, a familiar voice, echoed through his mind. You could have saved them, Rourke. You were too late. You always are. Rourke stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was his own. It was his guilt, his shame, trying to pull him down into the darkness. Stop, Rourke muttered to himself. I'm not that man anymore. I've changed. I've learned. Elira reached out and touched his arm. Rourke, don't listen to it. We're here together. We're going to make it. Her words cut through the fog in his mind. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the trust. She was relying on him. He couldn't let her down. With a deep breath, Rourke continued down the stairs, determined to face whatever came next. Elira followed, and as they descended deeper into the cradle, the shadows seemed to fade. The further they went, the clearer the path became. It was as if the cradle was testing their resolve, challenging them to overcome their inner demons, to face their fears head-on. Finally, they'd reached the bottom. The shadows were gone, replaced by a soft, warm light that filled the chamber. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested a small, glowing crystal, the key to the Lysari's future. Rourke stepped forward, reaching out to touch the crystal. As his fingers brushed against it, a powerful surge of energy ran through his body. He saw flashes of the future, the fate of Elira's people, the decisions they would make, and the challenges they would face. He saw the cradle's purpose, not just to protect the Lysari, but to guide them. The voice of the cradle spoke again, this time with pride. You have proven yourselves worthy. The path is now open. Rourke stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. The test was over. They had succeeded. But the journey was far from over.